All right, welcome to our lecture on the New England colonies as well as just the more northern part of America. So, yesterday we talked about the Jamestown colony, right, and how it was driven by profit. So, today we're going to focus on the colonies that were driven by religion, right? So, the people coming to these colonies, most of them were seeking religious freedom from persecution they had been dealing with in Great Britain. All right. So the first one we're going to talk about is Plymouth. Okay. So Plymouth was founded in 1620 by 24 different Puritan families. Now we're going to talk some more about Puritans. But Puritans were the kind of primary religion of the time coming across the ocean. So they left England, again, to escape the religious persecution. So there was a lot of Catholic versus Protestant in in Europe and specifically in England. And these people wanted to leave that and be able to kind of worship the way that they wanted to worship. So they were considered separatists because they were separate than what the primary religions believe. So they were persecuted for that. So they wanted to leave. So they landed in Plymouth Bay, which as you can see on the map over here. Okay, it's just above Virginia. So Virginia's down here, and then Plymouth you see is right there. So on the way over, they signed what's called the Mayflower Compact. Now you're going to read this document. It'll be one of the primary sources. It's a very important document in our history because it is the first example of the idea of representative government. Then you're going to see, if you remember from yesterday in Jamestown, you have the House of Burgesses, right? You've got that practically working. But the Mayflower Compact is the first kind of written documentation of that. So it establishes a civil government run by the people. And at the time, it's not massively significant, but it is a decisive step towards that self-governance, right? Towards the idea of democracy and the things that in a lot of ways we believe in today. Now, one of the other major colonies that was established was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, okay? So this is established by the Massachusetts Bay Company, and that was a joint stock company. Hopefully you remember from yesterday what a joint stock company was, right? That's that idea that these groups of people or companies come together in one endeavor, right? One purchase, essentially, into the colony to get that charter from Britain to allow them to go. And they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, this is led by a guy named John Winthrop, who is a Puritan. Okay, and he had this idea of kind of this utopian society, this city on a hill where everybody around the world could look at this place as, hey, this is the perfect place to be, and denounce things like greed and immorality, right? Very religious, very focused on religious beliefs. So the irony of the Puritans was that they escaped England looking for freedom of worship, right? So they could worship however they wanted. The irony of it is that in America, in the colonies, anytime somebody wanted to worship something different, they persecuted them, right? So they left England to escape the persecution, and then they turn around and become the people persecuting. So there's a lot of irony there. And there are two major dissenters you need to be familiar with. The first one's name is Roger Williams. So he was a Puritan, and then he split and had a lot of controversial views. He is pushed out, and then he goes on to found Providence, Rhode Island, in 1636. And he said, hey, here in Providence, we guarantee a separation of church and state. So what the government and people are doing is not gonna go along with the religion. So if you don't believe us, that's okay. Believe like us, that's okay. You can still exist here, as well as religious freedom. So no matter what you worship, you can worship it here. And then you also had Anne Hutchinson. So she was banned from the Massachusetts Bay Colony for being a separatist. She then went to that Providence, Rhode Island colony for a while and then ended up in New Netherland, which we will talk about here soon. Okay. So in addition to the religious conflict going on with the Puritans and those who disagree with the Puritans, there was also land dispute. And as I'm sure you'll guess, the land dispute was with the natives. So as more settlers came in, they needed more space. So they're on the East Coast, right? You see that here. Most of these major things are on the East Coast. They start moving this way, right? They start moving west. And of course, natives are already there. So now you're going to see some more of that conflict like we saw in Jamestown happen. So you also had New Hampshire established as well as Connecticut established. Now, the first major conflict in the North with the natives was called King Philip's War. So after about 40 years of tensions rising between the natives and the New England colonies, you had this conflict break out. So there was a chief, and his name was Metacom. Now, the colonists called him King Philip. And he gets a group of Native American tribes together to fight against the settlers. So he unites these different groups into one big group to try to go in and fight against the settlers. Now, this was a very destructive battle, very destructive. A lot of people die, a lot of property destroyed, and the colonists are able to win. A lot of reasons, but a lot of it was practical stuff. The Native Americans, they couldn't produce food fast enough. Obviously, remember we talked about diseases like smallpox are spreading among the natives, and they just didn't have as many people as the colonists did. So they were either captured and sold as slaves, or they were driven further westward. What you're going to see as America expands to the west over the next couple hundred years, they're always running into natives and always continuing to push them west again until eventually we have the rise of reservations. So the immediate impact of this was that the natives lose most of their land in southern New England. So they're pushed out in general, but the biggest chunk of land they lost was in southern New England, where the colonists would then continue to settle. And that would lead to more development of the middle colonies. Okay, so we have three groups of colonies. We have the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies. Now, the middle colonies, as you would imagine, are kind of a merge of the New England colonies and the southern colonies because they are in the middle. And we'll talk again in detail about the different colonies and the different perspectives of the colonies and how the colonies are developed. So let's start with New York. So in 1621, the Dutch West India Trading Company establishes this place called New Netherland. It's not called New York initially. It's called New Netherland. So the colonists were very diverse, right? So if you think about New York today, right, it's a very big melting pot. That starts very early on. It's a very diverse place of not only race, but of culture and of religion and of a lot of different things. So a very diverse place. And there was a heavy focus on fur trading. So in that New Netherland idea, fur trading, especially with the French, became a very popular thing. So in 1664, the English come in and they take control of the colony, and it's renamed New York. So when the colony control is taken, it's given to the Duke of York, who then names it after himself. The Duke of York names it New York. And then he gives a portion of the land to his friends, and they name it New Jersey. So that's how New Netherland became New York and New Jersey. Okay, so Pennsylvania is a pretty unique colony in a lot of different ways, but it's founded in 1681 by William Penn, who was an English Quaker. So if you've ever seen like Quaker Oats, the guy on the box is a representation of William Penn. And of course, Pennsylvania after William Penn. So he establishes it as what they called a holy experiment. So it was this very new set of ideas for how a colony could potentially be successful. So if you moved to Pennsylvania, you got 50 acres of land if you were a male adult and then you would have the right to vote, right? So they weren't really focused on race here. Just keep in mind, women couldn't vote at all here. So if you were a male and you moved, you got 50 acres of land and had the right to vote. So that alone was going to attract a lot of people, which was going to change Pennsylvania over time, which we'll talk about soon. There was a representative assembly. So again, you were represented in a group of people, what you wanted, things like this. So it wasn't one person making all the decisions. It was a group making the decisions for everybody. religious toleration, right? You could practice whatever religion you wanted, and they were going to tolerate you, and they were going to be peaceful, which is that pacifism part. Because of that, they were able to maintain a very high level of peace with the local Native Americans, like no other colonies really could. So this is an important piece of the of this Pennsylvania experiment, was this relationship with Native Americans, which again helped culture grow some, and they became very big trading partners and all these kinds of things. So for about 50 years, this was successful. But keep in mind, the appeal of the land especially is going to bring a lot of people in. So over time, over decades, you have a lot of people who don't believe in the religious stuff just coming in for the land, and that group quickly becomes the majority, and then eventually a lot of the religious piece of the Quakers is no longer the majority, and it fades away. And that's when you see Pennsylvania start to change. So Maryland was another founding colony, right? So it's founded by Lord Baltimore, which is why the big city in Maryland is Baltimore. And it was founded as a Catholic haven. So Lord Baltimore, who was English, was worried about how this war of religions with Catholics and Protestants in Europe would affect Catholics specifically in America. So he creates Maryland. And he wanted Maryland to be a place where it didn't matter if you were Catholic or Protestant. You could come and you could live there peacefully. And after it's created, it is given to the aristocrats of these two religions, right? The kind of upper class of these religions. And then again, the goal being that it could be a religious, peaceful place. So it's very similar to Virginia because of its fertile land. So the populations in cities are going to form around rivers and water, which you're going to see throughout the entire group of colonies. The tobacco becomes a primary cash crop, which that means it's going to need indentured servants, and eventually you're going to have a very large slave population. So Maryland quickly evolves into something other than just a haven for people who were Catholic in the New World. And it was this breadbasket of culture. So the southern colonies, you've got Virginia and the Carolinas, right? At this time, North and South Carolina were the Carolinas, and then they split into two different colonies pretty quickly. But focused on the plantation system, okay? And obviously you had the cash crop of tobacco. And then the southern colonies in general have a tradition and history of human exploitation. So it starts with Native Americans as slaves, and then indentured servitudes, and then obviously slavery, and then eventually sharecropping, and right. So there is a tradition in the southern colonies and ultimately in the southern states of this human exploitation aspect. And then Georgia was founded by James Oglethorpe. There's Oglethorpe County. That's actually where I went to high school, but Oglethorpe County was named after this guy. And it was a buffer colony. So Georgia, when it was created, was meant to be essentially just a space between Florida, which was controlled by the Spanish, and the Carolinas, which were the heavy tobacco growing place at the time, so that the Spanish couldn't easily just come in and take over. If you've ever driven from North Georgia to South Georgia, or just from like Atlanta to Valdosta, right? If you've ever driven to Florida, you've done this road on 75. You know it's like 4 hours, just the same thing over and over and over again. Imagine without a car. Imagine walking that or on a horse. It would take a long time. So this was a big benefit to the safety of the colonies, the Carolinas and up. And then they had a ton of people in Europe who were in debt and couldn't pay, so they were thrown in jail. And Europe had a massive overpopulation in prisons. So they would take those people and they'd say, hey, we'll forgive your debt, but you have to leave Europe and go to Georgia. And they would do that. So it also gave them people as a buffer. So Georgia was originally established not really as something as a huge benefit to cash crops, things like that. It was more protection from the Spanish. So how did we have this massive migration to the New World? So keep in mind, the colonies are established, but obviously people are going to continue to come to them. So why? So in Europe, specifically in Britain, right, there's a lot of financial struggles. They fought some wars. There's some debt, and a lot of people are unemployed, a lot of things like that. There's also that religious persecution piece, which we talked about. So you have a lot of people that want to leave, right? So between 1600 and 1700, you have a large group of people leave. So by 1700, there's approximately 250,000 Europeans who had migrated to North America. A lot of people at that time. It doesn't sound like a ton now because the world is so much bigger, but 250,000 people at that time is a massive number. And then in that next 76 years, right? So between 1700 and 1776, when America declares independence, the population is 2.5 million. So it is multiplied tenfold in a very short amount of time, which shows you that this was a very appealing place to be. So most of the immigrants early on, especially, were British, but over time, you have a lot of different countries coming in. Scotland, Ireland, and Germany were the three big countries other than Britain that had a large migration population. Okay, so you guys probably remember this from econ, push-pull factors. So you had push factors, which, keep in mind, push factors are the things that are pushing people out. These are generally negative. So the three push factors for the immigrants were political turmoil, economic hardship, and religious persecution. So governments in conflict, fighting, things like that. Economic hardships, again, unemployment, can't afford food, things like that. And then religious persecution. So as time goes, Britain's economy gets better. The religious conflict subsides. The political turmoil subsides. So you see a lot of British immigrants stopping to immigrate. So the number for British immigrants gets less and less and less. And the Scottish and Irish get less, but they continue to immigrate, and they're really known for three major waves in the early to mid 1600s, and then in the 1660s you start to see those decline as well. So just to give you all of these in one place, you slide this up a little bit, right? You have the New England colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, and the southern colonies of Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, which again would eventually split north and south, and Georgia. So this is going to be a chart you're going to want to be familiar with. Again, we're going to dig into these specifics, but just so you have everything in one place to know which belong to which. Okay, so now we're going to dig into the specific pieces of these colonies. So this is going to give you a really good understanding of how these developed and why they developed that way. And then ultimately, you'll see this evolve into kind of how the North and South develop as we go from now till the Civil War. Okay, so we're going to start with the economics. So in New England, the economics were focused on what we call staple crops, as well as things like shipping. Okay, so in the North, if you've ever been to the North, you know that the winters are very cold, snow. It's not good for growing cash crops, right? You can grow staple crops, which staple crops are crops that help you live, right? So wheat, corn, potatoes, those are staple crops. They're not going to make you a ton of money, but you can eat them, you can live on them, right? You can't eat and live on tobacco and cotton, but you can make a lot of money on those, and they're called cash crops, right? So staple crops versus cash crops. And then the soil is not good for growing, and it just doesn't work for farming. So they focused on those cash crops, as well as they did a lot of shipping. So lumber and fish, a lot of timber. They would build ships. There's a lot of things that the North was able to do, and that's why the northern cities, the major ones like Boston, New York, these cities are port cities. They're on the water because they do a lot of shipping. They do a lot of trading, and they become these major trade centers. So the middle colonies, okay, again, you're going to see this with the economics, the geography, the natives, everything. The middle colonies are kind of a middle ground. So they're most heavily affected by the rivers in their area, right? So at this time, there's no highways. So the rivers are the highways of the day. So they would use specifically the Hudson and the Delaware to transport their goods in and out of America, right? In and out of the colonies. So they did focus on trading not only with colonists, but also with Native Americans. So there was a little more of that going on in the middle colonies. And then you also have these harbor cities like Philly, New York. Again, I said New York and the New England. Sorry about that. But the point remains the same of they became these big trading ports. So they were also able to farm because they had a much more temperate climate. Now, again, they weren't going to be able to farm a ton of cash crops. It was more staple crops, but they could do more of it because the farmland is much better in those places. And then again, allowed them to become truly the middle of economics. And then in the southern colonies, this is the stuff you guys are more familiar with because you grew up here, most of you. Obviously, there's a heavy emphasis on farming. So it starts with tobacco, right? It's the monster in the South. It becomes cotton later, but tobacco is the big thing in the South, as well as indigo, corn, and rice. So indentured servitude early on becomes the primary source of labor, and then it leads to the beginning of the roots of slavery, right? So again, slavery, as we know it, doesn't exist yet. Right now, it's indentured servitude, some natives as slaves. You still have slavery happening from Africa, but it's not the way that it's going to become. And then you had some of the major shipping ports as well, Charleston and Savannah being the two biggest ones. If you've ever been to either of those cities in South Carolina or in Georgia, you know they're big shipping cities. Okay, religion in the colonies. So as the religious persecution is big in England, right? A lot of the settlers come to the New World and the colonies looking for religious freedom. So you had the Puritans. We talked about them, right? They're that primary group, religious group that left England because they were viewed as dissenters. And then, of course, again, that irony is that they became persecutors. But that's the original purpose of the New England colonies, was a desire for religious freedom. The middle colonies, we see similar trends of the mix. The middle colonies were known a lot more for their religious diversity and cultural diversity. So even though in New England a lot of them were founded on because of religious persecution, they became religious persecutors. In the middle colonies, you didn't see that as much. There was a lot more religious freedom. And it becomes kind of this melting pot. Again, in New York is a great example. It became a very transient place because people would come and go as they would trade and these different kinds of things. So it introduced a lot of cultures and people and ideas into one place. The southern colonies, okay, so religion was not a focus at all, with one exception, and that was Maryland. If you remember, Maryland was founded as that place for peace between Catholics and Protestants. So that's why they were founded. And it leads to the Act of Toleration. This is one of the first major kind of religious acts in the New World. And it guaranteed that in Maryland, if you were a Christian, it didn't matter if you were Protestant or Catholic, you were guaranteed religious freedom. So that's really the only religious piece we see in southern colonies. Now, relationships with natives. The Puritans viewed natives as savages. They believed that they needed to be saved from their savage ways, and that led to a lot of the different issues. So early on, the relationship between the natives and the colonists in the New England colonies is okay. It was heavily based in a couple things, trade as well as just survival. The natives knew things the colonists didn't. But as time passed and more colonists show up, you see this relationship deteriorate and becomes a much more heavily conflicted thing. So we talked about King Philip's War. You also had the Pequot Wars, which were a series of battles between colonists and the natives. So you just see that relationship deteriorating. In the middle colonies, okay, they definitely had the best relationship of the three groups. The natives were relied on heavily for trade. They weren't the target of conflict and of expansion. They were looked at as allies. And obviously, again, just like in New England, that does change and get worse. And then in Pennsylvania, they definitely had more respect for the natives. An example, Penn said that if you're going to take the natives' land, you need to pay them for it. So he believed in taking care of them as well. And then in the southern colonies, very much like New England, they started okay, but over time, as people extended and as those people wanted more land, it got more tense. Keep in mind, in the South, they wanted to expand faster because more land equaled more tobacco fields, equaled more money, right? So in the South, they're trying to expand further west, not necessarily for more people to live, but for more fields. And then as the the desire for that grew and more colonists grew, right, it fueled more and more conflict as time went on. So that's it for the colonies. The big things you want to make sure you can identify the differences of are the economics, the natives, and the religion, which is why there's kind of a whole separate piece on that. So make sure that you feel good about that. Obviously, as always, if you have any questions, please ask, and have a great day.